She thought she had already won. She thought my son's house, his savings, his life insurance policy, and everything he'd spent 32 years building were already hers to spend. She stood at his graveside, with her hand resting on the shoulder of a man I had never seen before, and when she caught me looking at her from across the rows of folding chairs, she didn't look away. She held my gaze for a long moment, and then she smiled. That was the morning I buried my son. His name was Daniel. He was 38 years old, and he died on a Tuesday in February from what the death certificate called sudden cardiac arrest. He had been healthy, or so I believed. He ran. He ate well. He called me every Sunday evening without fail, and 3 weeks before he died, he had called me on a Wednesday instead, which was unusual, and he had said something I didn't fully understand at the time. He said, "Dad, I need you to know that I've been taking care of things. Whatever happens, the right people are going to be protected." I asked him what he meant. He laughed a little and told me not to worry, that he would explain everything when he came to visit in the spring. He never made it to spring. The man standing beside my daughter-in-law at the funeral was introduced to me by her sister as just a friend from work. He wore a dark gray suit that fit him too well for a Tuesday funeral. He brought flowers that cost more than most people spend on a week of groceries. His name was Marcus, and he stood close enough to my daughter-in-law that their arms touched, and neither of them moved apart when other people walked by. I said nothing. I was burying my son, my only child. My wife had passed 6 years before, and Daniel had been the last of what we built together, and I was 64 years old and standing in February wind trying to remember how to breathe. My daughter-in-law found me after the service, beside the black car that had carried the casket. She was composed in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with having rehearsed. She told me the reception was at the house, that I was welcome to come, and then she said, in the same even voice she might use to read a grocery list, that after today, she would need some time alone with her son, and that she hoped I would understand if things became a little distance for a while. I told her I understood. I told her I loved my grandson. She nodded and said, "Of course," in a way that closed the door on the subject. My grandson was 8 years old. His name was Noah. He had Daniel's laugh, that sudden barking laugh that surprised you every time. And he had a habit of collecting interesting rocks and presenting them to people as gifts. And when I arrived at that reception, and he came running at me across the kitchen floor in his small dress shoes and wrapped both arms around my waist, I held him for longer than I probably should have. He smelled like his father's house. He smelled like Sunday dinners and wood polish, and the particular warmth of a home where someone still lived and cooked and cared. That was the last time I held him for a long while. 3 days after the funeral, my daughter-in-law called me. She did not begin with hello. She said, "I've spoken with my attorney, and I want you to know where things stand." She told me that Daniel's estate was straightforward, that everything had been left to her, and that she was planning to sell the house by summer. She told me that the guitar collection Daniel had inherited from my father-in-law, a collection of 17 instruments that my son had spent years maintaining and documenting, would be sold along with everything else. She told me that she did not believe ongoing contact with my side of the family was in Noah's best interest, given that the transition was going to be difficult enough without additional complications. I asked her what she meant by complications. She said, "You ask a lot of questions for someone who has no legal standing here." I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that call ended. The afternoon light moved across the floor the way it does in winter, slow and pale and without warmth. I thought about Daniel saying the right people are going to be protected. I thought about the way he had laughed when he said it. That small, private laugh that meant he knew something I didn't yet. I called his attorney. Not my daughter-in-law's attorney. Daniel's. His name was Raymond, and he had been Daniel's personal attorney for 11 years. Since before the marriage, since before Noah. He was careful on the phone in a way that told me he had been waiting for my call. He said he could not discuss the specifics of the estate over the phone, but that there was going to be a formal reading of the will in 2 weeks, and that I had been named, and that I should be there. I asked him if my daughter-in-law knew I had been named. He paused for a moment and said, "She has been informed that you are included." The 2 weeks between that phone call and the reading were the longest of my life, since the days after my wife died. My daughter-in-law stopped responding to my texts about seeing Noah. When I drove past the house on a Saturday afternoon, both cars were in the driveway, including one I didn't recognize, a black SUV registered to nobody I knew. I did not stop. I drove past slowly, and I noticed that the curtains in Daniel's study, which had always been open in daylight, were closed. I started paying attention differently after that. I had spent 37 years as a structural engineer. My entire professional life had been built on reading what people couldn't see, the stress inside a beam, the load distribution across a floor that looked fine from the outside. I knew how to look at a thing calmly and ask where it would fail. I started asking that question about everything I could remember from the last year of Daniel's life. He had called me 6 months before he died and mentioned, without much context, that he had changed his filing system. I hadn't thought anything of it at the time. He was organized. He was always reorganizing. But now I remembered that when he said it, he sounded tired in a specific way. Not physically tired, but the tired of someone who has been carrying something alone for too long. He had also, in the last year, sold 2 of the guitars from his collection. Not the most valuable ones, the middle ones. I had asked him about it once, and he said he needed to liquidate some assets for a project. I did not ask what project. I went back through my phone and found every text he had sent me in the last 18 months. I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down every anomaly, every phrase that felt like it carried more weight than I had given it at the time. By the time I was done, I had 3 pages of notes and a feeling in my chest that was part grief and part something colder. The morning of the will reading, I arrived at Raymond's office 20 minutes early. My daughter-in-law arrived 7 minutes after me, and she walked in with Marcus, not with her sister, not with a friend, with Marcus. She introduced him to the paralegal as her partner, and she said the word partner, the way people say a word they have been practicing, evenly, without apology, as a statement of fact. I looked at her. I looked at Marcus. I thought about the February graveside, the way their arms had touched, the suit that fit too well. Raymond's office was on the 4th floor of a building downtown. The room where we sat was quiet and unremarkable, the kind of room designed to make whatever happens inside it feel settled and final. There was a small table, 4 chairs, a window overlooking the parking structure across the street. My daughter-in-law sat down and placed her handbag on the table and looked at Raymond with the expression of someone waiting for a formality to conclude. Raymond opened a folder and began. The first items were expected. The house went to his wife. The primary bank accounts went to his wife. The life insurance policy, a substantial one, designated his wife as beneficiary. She nodded at each one, and with each nod, her posture loosened slightly, the way a person relaxes when they are confirming what they already knew. Then Raymond set down the first sheet and lifted a second one. He said, "There is one additional document." My daughter-in-law looked up. Raymond said, approximately 14 months before his death, Daniel executed a separate legal instrument, a revocable trust, subsequently made irrevocable upon his death, which was not disclosed to the primary estate, and which was structured specifically to remain independent of marital assets. The room was very quiet. She said, "What does that mean?" Raymond said it clearly. It meant that Daniel had, over the course of the year before he died, moved a portion of his separately owned assets, the proceeds from the guitar sales, a brokerage account he had opened in his own name before the marriage, and a piece of property in his grandfather's name that he had inherited directly into a trust that was legally separate from the marital estate. The trust named 2 beneficiaries. The first was me. The second was Noah, held in protective custody until the boy turned 25, administered by Raymond as trustee. My daughter-in-law said, "That's not possible." Raymond said it was not only possible, it had been carefully executed, notarized, and filed 14 months prior. She turned to Marcus, and something passed between them that I watched very carefully, because it was not the look of 2 people receiving unexpected news. It was the look of 2 people whose plan has encountered a problem they did not fully account for. She said, "I want to contest it." Raymond said she was welcome to do so, but that the trust had been structured by a specialist in asset protection, that Daniel had been of sound mind, that there was no evidence of coercion, and that the timeline predated any discussion of divorce or estate planning on her part by nearly 8 months. That last phrase sat in the room like something dropped on a stone floor. She said, "What discussion of estate planning on my part?" Raymond looked at her steadily and said nothing. I drove home that afternoon in a state I cannot fully describe. I was grieving. I was grateful. I was furious in the specific way you become furious when you understand, fully and finally, what someone was willing to do and how long they had been doing it. Over the next several weeks, I learned things I had not known. I learned them the way you learn things when you are patient and quiet, and willing to sit with what you don't understand until it becomes clear. Daniel's college roommate, a man named Greg, who still lived in the same city, called me 2 weeks after the will reading. He had been close to Daniel since they were 19, and he said he had been waiting, that he had promised Daniel he would wait until after the reading before he said anything. He said Daniel had confided in him about 8 months before he died. Not everything, but enough. Daniel had discovered that my daughter-in-law had been involved with Marcus for at least 2 years. He had discovered it the way you discover these things when you are smart and have been quietly paying attention. A charge on a card, a changed password on a shared account, a voicemail she didn't know he had heard. He had not confronted her immediately. He had done what a careful man does. He went to an attorney. He began quietly protecting what he had built, and he waited for the moment to have the harder conversation. He never got to that conversation. His heart gave out before he did. The medical examiner had ruled it cardiac arrest. Daniel had an undetected structural issue with his heart, something that can sit quietly for decades and then one day doesn't. I have spent time in the months since wondering about things I cannot verify and probably never will. I have also tried, in the hours when I am most honest with myself, to focus on what I can know and what I cannot, and not to build a life on the wrong kind of certainty. What I know is this: my son was protecting his family the only way he could, which was quietly, legally, and without making a scene. What I also know is that my daughter-in-law and Marcus were not finished after the will reading. 2 months later, Raymond called me and told me they had filed a contest. They brought in their own attorney, a man who specialized in trust litigation, and the basis of their challenge was that Daniel had acted under undue influence, specifically my influence, and that the trust had been established in bad faith. They submitted a letter, supposedly written by Daniel and signed, in which he expressed doubts about the trust and indicated he had been pressured by his father. I read that letter. Daniel did not write it. I know my son's voice the way I know my own hands. I have every text he ever sent me, every email, 3 decades of birthday cards written in his particular handwriting, with his particular phrasings. That letter used words Daniel did not use. It was smooth in places where he was blunt, and vague in places where he was specific. And it was dated 11 months before his death, during a period when I had his phone records, and during that exact week, he had texted me about a fishing trip we were planning for the following summer. A man writing a formal legal letter expressing serious doubts about a major financial decision does not in the same week exchange 14 texts about which lake has better bass fishing. I brought everything to Raymond. He brought it to a forensic document examiner. The examiner needed 3 days. The signature was Daniel's, extracted from another document, and transferred. The letter itself had been composed by someone else. The paper it was printed on had been manufactured after the date it was supposedly written. I want to be clear about what I felt when I received that report. I was not triumphant. I was not relieved. I was standing in my garage, which is where I go when I need to be somewhere without walls closing in. And I held that report, and I felt something break loose inside me that had been held very tight for a long time. Not grief, exactly. Something older and heavier. The understanding that someone had looked at my son's death, at the fact of him being gone, and had seen in that absence an opportunity. The attorneys referred the matter to the district attorney's office. My daughter-in-law was arrested on a Wednesday morning. Marcus was arrested the same afternoon. The charges included document fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit estate fraud. I learned later that investigators had found, on Marcus's personal laptop, draft versions of the forged letter, along with a separate document that appeared to be a modified version of an earlier version of the trust, altered in ways that would have shifted all distributions in her favor. They had been planning it for a while. That was what the investigators believed, and what the evidence suggested. The contest had not been a reaction to the will reading. It had been prepared in advance. I did not go to the courthouse when they were arraigned. I stayed home. I sat on the back porch and drank coffee and watched two squirrels argue over something in the oak tree at the edge of the yard, and I thought about Daniel, about the last time I saw him in person, which had been Thanksgiving, 4 months before he died. He had walked me out to my car after dinner, and we had stood in the driveway in the November cold, and he had told me he was proud of me for retiring when I did, for not working past the time when work was still good for me. That was the kind of thing Daniel said. Not maudlin, not sentimental, just precise and true, and said in a way that told you he had thought about it. I thought about how he had stood in that driveway, and how neither of us had known that would be the last time. Noah was not present at any of this. He was 9 years old by then, and he was staying with my daughter-in-law's parents in the weeks after the arrest, which I thought was probably the right place for him while things settled. I had not seen him since the day of the reception. That was the hardest part, and I want to say that plainly and without softening it, because it is the part that has cost me the most sleep. He is not Daniel's biological son. I learned this from Raymond, who had learned it from documents Daniel's own investigators had uncovered in the months before his death. Daniel had known, or had suspected, and had been in the process of verifying. He had included Noah in the trust anyway. He had done that deliberately. And I believe he had done it because whatever the biology said, Noah was the boy who had grown up in his house, and called him Dad, and brought him rocks as gifts, and Daniel was the kind of man who did not abandon that just because a document told him to. I have thought about this more than I have thought about almost anything in the past year. I have thought about the 8-year-old boy who lost his father, and then, in the weeks and months that followed, lost the rest of the world he knew, while the adults around him were occupied with documents and attorneys and fraud investigations. I have thought about what he understands and what he doesn't, and I have thought about what my son would have wanted. I made a decision. I did not fight for custody. I am 64 years old, and I am alone, and the courts would have put Noah in foster care, or with my daughter-in-law's parents before they put him with me, and I am honest enough to recognize that a 9-year-old boy in that situation needs stability more than he needs a grandfather who is still working through his own grief. Her parents are decent people. They were as shocked by their daughter's actions as anyone. They love Noah. He is safe. But I called Raymond, and I asked him about the portion of the trust designated for Noah. It was substantial, not life-altering rich, substantial, but a sum that, managed correctly, could pay for his education twice over and leave something remaining. I asked Raymond what protections were in place to ensure that money was insulated from any future legal action by my daughter-in-law or anyone acting on her behalf. Raymond told me they were considerable, but that I could add to them. I did, and then I asked Raymond to reach out, through appropriate channels and entirely at his discretion, to her parents, to let them know that if Noah ever wanted to visit, ever wanted to know his grandfather, my door was open. I did not ask for anything. I did not create a legal obligation. I left a door open, and I walked away from it, and I let it be whatever it was going to be. I have been asked, by people who know the story, whether I regret not fighting harder for Noah. I have been asked this by my neighbor, by Greg, by a woman I was seated next to at a dinner last fall who had read something about the case. Each time I tell them what I believe, that love is not always loud, that the most important things Daniel ever did for the people he cared about, he did quietly and in advance, without fanfare, in ways they didn't fully understand until later. I am trying to be that kind of man. I retired properly last summer. Not the kind of retirement I'd planned when Daniel was still alive. The kind with fishing trips and grandchildren's school plays. The quieter kind. I have a small workshop in the back of the house where I do things with my hands, and I have the kind of mornings that belong entirely to me. And I have learned, slowly, that these things have their own value. My daughter-in-law pled guilty in October. She received a suspended sentence and 3 years of supervised probation. Marcus received 18 months. The forged letter was entered into the court record and then became irrelevant. Everything proceeded as Daniel had set it in motion, before any of the rest of it, in the careful quiet of a man who understood that the best protection is the kind you build before you need it. 3 months ago, on a Sunday evening around 7, my phone rang. The number was one I didn't recognize. I answered it, because I always answer numbers I don't recognize now. I don't want to miss things the way I missed things before. It was Noah. He said, "Grandpa?" in a voice that was slightly lower than I remembered, because he was 9.5 now and growing. He said he had asked his grandma to dial the number, and that he had a rock he wanted to tell me about. He had found it at the edge of a creek near her house, and it had a vein of something pink running through it, and he thought I might know what it was. I sat down on the floor